So now we can move on to chapter 2. And in chapter 2 this is where we go straight into the state of nature issue. Now, when we deal with the state of nature, we need to establish what exactly is that the proponents of state of nature theories are specifying. Now, the state of nature can be broken down into 3 separate sections. Now, the first thing that we have is the individuals that are supposed to supposed to exist in this state of nature and enter into a political unity. The second thing that we should have is an election by which these people in the state of nature elect a sovereign. And that brings us to the third point, which is the sovereign and the state of being which exists after that point at which the sovereign exists. Now, what we need to do then is to break down these 3 separate parts to then establish, well, first of all, evidence. So we can begin with the evidence question. Now, it gets a little bit tricky here because when we talk about evidence, well, if we go back to Hobbes and we go back to Locke, at the time they were writing, they were receiving reports from the New World of South America and North America. And they seem to have been interpreting these people in those regions as living in a state of nature, which a lot of people at the time seem to have been doing as well. So when we say that evidence, that kind of would work as evidence for them, but we don't want to consider that part at the moment. What we want to do is focus on the old world, where Hobbes and Locke and the rest were writing. So we want to look for evidence in the old world, in England, in France, in Italy, and this region, or even the greater region of the old world, which would include China, the Arabian areas, that type of thing. So we can put aside the New World for the moment. So first of all, we need to establish where the state of nature was. Now, if we look at Hobbes and we look at Locke, we can establish, and people like that, we can establish that first of all they would have, I assumed, understood that the state of nature didn't exist in early medieval period before their period, because they would have had access to basic history. And we could probably establish that they didn't think it existed during the Roman and Greek period, because they would have been familiar with literature from that period. I mean, this would have been quite well known, and also from biblical records as well. They would have known that there was no state of nature at that point. So we'd have to go back further. I mean, with Locke particularly, you could probably say the state of nature in his understanding would have been the Garden of Eden, which maybe he was thinking the people in the New World were living in a kind of a similar situation. But we can kind of sidestep that point for now and focus on the history. So first of all, we can establish that the state of nature in the old world, in England, France, and that type of thing, didn't exist in the medieval period. It didn't exist in the Roman period. It didn't exist in the Greek period. We can say it didn't exist in the Bronze Age period as well, which then brings us to needing to go a little bit further back than Locke and Hobbes would have gone. So we'll go back to prior to the Bronze Age. So we'll be in the Neolithic, and then possibly earlier than that, the Mesolithic, and even earlier than that. So first of all then, if it's not in the medieval period, it's not in the Iron Age, Bronze Age, then we have to go to the Neolithic, and then we need to look at what evidence is available from that period. Do we find any orders during that period which seem to be in a state of nature? Now, from archaeology, from records that we do have, and what evidence we can pick up from this period, basically the answer is completely no. There are no state of nature kind of organizations at that point. We don't have individuals just milling about outside of any sort of order. They definitely did have order. They lived in sociable situations. We know that. We know that from kind of literature which has survived kind of from the Bronze Age period, which kind of depicts people in the Neolithic state, and also the orders which have survived from that. And again, we also have it from archaeology. We know that the Neolithic people didn't They just didn't live in a state of nature. It's just not something that's realistic to presume. It's just not a real thing that we can take as being a thing that happened. We have cities. We have, well, I mean, it's not entirely clear if we could call them cities from that period and periods shortly after that. But we have things like Çatalhöyük in Turkey, where we have temple complexes. Again, it's not even clear if we can call them temple complexes. The state of the situation at that time is very hard to explain and very hard to model. But the important thing which we can say is they weren't living in a state of nature. What we do know they were doing, to a point, is they were living in kind of like sacrificial ritual orders. So what you'll find again in like places like Çatalhöyük and places connected to that, and also if you go to China and even in the New World with some of the orders in those areas, you have these farming communities, and what they seem to be engaging in is this process of animal sacrifice. And like what we would call it would be a very religious world. But I mean, the word religious, as we'll get to later on, is a very bad term to use for it. It's best to use the term ritual and sacrificial for these people. Now, what they were doing is they were basically sacrificing farm animals, agricultural animals, to gods, and then trying to read the augury, so what messages the gods were giving back to them through this process. In many places, like this augury would have lots of different ways of being expressed. So in some places they would just check the liver of the animal to see if the liver had been damaged or other organs. In other places, like for example China, they would burn the bones, burn the turtle bones, which is where you get the Chinese system of writing from, the oracle bones. Or you'd have people studying the rising of incest smoke, or there seems to have been an infinite amount of ways by which people were trying to decipher what the gods were communicating back to them through this sacrificial process. So we have these highly complex orders existing in the Neolithic before agriculture actually it was even implemented in large scale, again with Çatalhöyük. And we're just finding evidence of very large-scale settlements in places like Romania and the Ukraine, so Eastern Europe, where we've got tens of thousands of people living in these. Again, they're not even sure what to call them at the moment, like mega-cities, mega-villages. It's not clear. Now, the important point to take from all of this is that they were not living in a state of nature. These were not just random individuals just milling around and just sort of living violently, attacking each other as individuals, which kind of doesn't really make much sense anyway. So then we have to go back much earlier to find something which maybe is comparable to the situation of the people in the New World. So you'd have to go back even before the Neolithic, so before any sort of agriculture or farming, anything of like that existed, and people were living maybe like hunter-gathering lifestyles. But the thing is, that's something we'll get to in the next chapter, but even then, the state of nature doesn't seem to exist there. So, but before we can go to this older history, the older period in time, we'll focus back on this period for a moment, and then we'll ask another question. So, first of all, we've established that in the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, the Neolithic, for what we can see, what evidence we have, there's no evidence of a state of nature. So, if we don't have the state of nature at that point, and we assumed it existed earlier, and then the election must have happened so that at this point, the Neolithic, the Bronze Age and Iron Age, we had sovereigns that have been elected at this point, then we need to look for an election. Now, we don't have any evidence of that at all. I mean, if we did, we would have been told about it. And even if it did happen, I mean, it's hard to see how we'd get evidence of that. It's not something which would have been recorded in history through archaeology, and most of these places didn't have writing, so it wouldn't have been recorded there. So if we skip past that and we go to the sovereign, then we have to, considering that we don't have a state of nature, then according to modern liberal political theory, at this point we must have sovereigns. But here we hit a massive insurmountable problem. We don't have sovereigns at this point, which is right off the bat a giant hole in the hull of liberal political theory, because liberal political theory is stipulating that we have the state of nature, an election, and then sovereign. But we don't have a state of nature here, and we don't have a sovereign or an order with a sovereign at the center, which is something which doesn't get the focus I believe it deserves. So, for example, let's pick one of these orders. Let's pick the Greeks. Can we say that the Greeks had a sovereign in the modern liberal sense? A sovereign being defined as a person who is the source of law and is supreme over all others in that sense. In the Greek orders, in Homeric Greek, absolutely not. There's no evidence of that at all. If we get to classical Greek, then again, we don't have that. The closest we get to something along those lines would be the tyrants, which is an uncomfortable point to point out with regards to modernity. Because, you see, the Greeks, they didn't consider, well, in the classical period, in the earlier period, they didn't consider a person as being capable of making the law until you get something similar to that again with the tyrants. Before that, they were like pretty much all of the other Indo-European orders in that they saw law as coming from the gods. The gods would be the ones stipulating what the law is, and even if you had lawmakers, they didn't make the law as we understand it. It's a bad term for them. So, for example, with Solon, who is quite famous law, a better definition would be a lawgiver. Now, he didn't. I mean, this could be argued about, but I don't believe the Greeks saw him as the one creating the law. It didn't come from him. They would have saw him as being the one who was interpreting what the law should be as determined by the gods. That's why when he completed his laws, they had a sacrificial ceremony to confirm that the laws were the gods' will, basically. And we have that through all of the different orders of that type, the Indo-European orders. We have that in Rome as well, and all the other ones. And if you look at the history of law, you can see this quite clearly. Like one of the oldest law text, Hammurabi's law, is a very bad description of it because it's not really his law. You can see it on the stele where it has the god, I believe it's called Shamash, behind him, who's guiding his hand as he's writing it. So it's better understood as Shamash's law, and Hammurabi is the one bringing it into this world and writing it into this world. So someone like Solon, who was writing the laws and resetting the constitution, he wasn't sovereign as we understood it at all. The gods would have been sovereign in that sense, which is something we'll get to at a later chapter. But for now, the focus should be on the fact that here there's no sovereign and there's no state of nature. Now, one possible get-out clause that modernity could use in this instance is that they could claim that these orders did indeed have sovereigns. It's just that the people in those orders didn't understand this, and it was misunderstood. But there was a sovereign, which was a person who was the one who's creating the law. So you could say Solon was that, in which case you disqualify all reference to the gods and you focus specifically on the human individual in question and just dictate that they are the sovereign, which is possible. But again, that's something we'll come back to at a later point. But for these people, they didn't see themselves as being sovereign, and they didn't see it in these terms. We don't get that until, again, we get to the philosophers and the tyrants, which again is a point we're going to come to later, because we don't want to lose focus on this point. So at this stage, we want to recap here. These Greek orders, the Roman orders, all of these others, there's no state of nature and there's no sovereign. Now, in the next chapter, we'll go back even further just to confirm that there's no state of nature in these previous orders. And we'll sidestep the issue of whether we can overlay a concept of a sovereign order onto these people, and just skip that and just say, for now, that's not a particularly reasonable thing to do. Again, I mean, you could say Solon was sovereign and that they just misunderstood it, but again, that's an argument I want to get to at a later point, and so we don't get distracted from this. for now, given that we've got no evidence here by normal standards, what I think is reasonable standards, that there's a state of nature or sovereign order at these points, I believe that at this very immediate point, we could dismiss the state of nature immediately because there's no evidence. But even if we just put that aside and we then look at the logical coherence of the state of nature, then we come across even more problems. Because if you go into the logical theory of the state of nature, there are so many issues with it, it becomes quite incredible. Now, one of the first issues you have with the state of nature is that, well, how is it that these individuals are supposed to come together and elect a sovereign in the first place when, for example, for a start, they don't have a shared language? This question of language is an unsolvable problem with the state of nature, because how are they going to know how to communicate with each other if they've not been in any sort of social organization before that point where they could learn language and share language with each other so that the different words have collective meaning? This is a problem with the state of nature more generally. It smuggles in concepts and requirements, and the basis of it requires concepts and ideas and things which already presuppose an order. Now, if we look at this language issue a bit more closely, imagine you've got two different people who do not speak the same language, but they do have a language system. Now, imagine if they engage in some sort of process of trying to communicate with each other by translating. They'll find maybe a third point of reference, like a tree, and they'll point at the tree, and they'll both say their word for tree. Now, in the simplest sense, you could say that's a way of engaging in this communication, but then you're going to have an entire order of people all doing that at the same time, while also all for some reason suddenly at the same time deciding that this would be better than just hitting each other on the head, for example, as Hobbes would claim, or this is the best way of ensuring that their private property is secured. They all have to do it spontaneously, exactly the same point, and then they have to start this process of communication translation. Now, one of the big problems with this is we're not just talking about all agreeing on what a tree is or what a rock is and coming together on that point. They all have to, at this exact point, assuming that they've even got language or comprehend language in the first place is not reasonable, because they've been living individually. How are they going to develop language individually? We can confirm this in real life, actually, because there are examples of people who have been raised outside of human orders or in complete isolation, and we can see that they don't have languages automatically. They can't. They just don't. There's some very sad cases of this where children have been locked up from birth in rooms in darkness, and they are subsequently unable to communicate properly. Or you have people who have been raised in wilderness, which amazingly has happened. And again, you have that problem as well. They don't just spontaneously generate language by themselves. Now, with the state of nature election, this becomes even more absurd, because they're not just coming together to agree what the word is going to be for a tree or a rock or something very, very simple like that. They're coming together to elect a sovereign. Now, the concept of somebody being a sovereign, which means that someone is above the laws, requires that these people then understand the concept of laws off the bat. And they also then need to understand the concept of a sovereign, which is a person who is above the laws, which is a concept which didn't exist in that sense until about 15th or 16th century, when the state of nature theorists were developing this idea. So you've got these individuals who don't have language, or shouldn't have language at this point. It's not clear how they would do that, because again, they don't have schools, they don't have social organization. Who's teaching them this language? How do they have the same language? And then they come together and then they agree to a very complex legalistic concept and then enact it. None of this makes any sense at all. It just really doesn't make any sense. It's complete nonsense. And there's so many other aspects of these individuals which would be, they would need to develop by themselves outside of any order, which doesn't make any sense. For example, like their wants, what they would want. For for me or you to want, for example, an iPhone, or to want some other thing, which in modernity we have. These are kind of wants which we have to be taught to want, and we have to be taught what not to want. So these wants are actually trainable. And same with our emotions as well. How are we supposed to feel in relation to certain things is not something which spontaneously generates from within ourselves. These are things which we have to be educated into, and we have to develop from observation of what others are doing. We learn. But state of nature theory just doesn't account for this. It assumes that these things are already a given when they're just not a given. So it all depends on this spontaneous nature of the individual, which is just appears by itself with all of these attributes fully formed. Now, when we have people like Locke, or people in that period of time, they were Christians. Now, at that point, they could have fallen back upon the crutch of just assuming that God had implanted these powers and capabilities into us from the very start. I mean, this is not to try and denigrate Christians or to try and imply that they're ignorant or they're being simplistic or silly with this. I mean, at their point in time, this would have been not an entirely unreasonable point to take. And Christians now, they wouldn't take this point. They would at some point, but not as simplistic as this. They would have, now I'm assuming most higher level Christians, ones operating at higher level in intellectual capability, would not take this as being the state of affairs. They would take that God would grant us the capabilities of developing these powers and capabilities, but not that he just snapped his fingers and put it into us fully formed. So we don't just come out as babies and we instantly have all of our individuality and can just operate as we do now. These are all things we have to be trained in, we have to develop, we have to absorb from the environment around us. So with Locke and kind of not really with Hobbes, because it doesn't seem like he was particularly Christian, but with others like Locke, they would have been able to fall back on this crutch and would have been able to say, well, the God would have just implanted these. But this is not something we're able to do now, and this creates even more problems for the state of nature model. And this is something which we'll get into in more detail at a later point in the book, but at this point we just want to refocus back on the point of this chapter. And the point of this chapter was to, first of all, establish where people like Hobbes and Locke and other state of nature theorists would think that the state of nature would exist in the old world. And again, medieval period, no. The Iron Age, the classical period, no. So it must be Neolithic at the least, and what evidence we have is that no, that is not the case. So then we go back, sovereigns. Were there sovereigns in the Roman period or the Greek period? In our modern sense, no. And if we go to Neolithic, what evidence we have, that just does not seem reasonable at all. So again, we could enter into this argument with people in modernity where they could say that they did have sovereigns, but they didn't understand it. But that's a different point altogether, and that's something we'll come to later on in the book again, because that's a criticism that can be leveled against them from a different angle, in the sense that what they've been doing is engaging in a process of what's called retrojection or presentism, where they're taking their categories and they're projecting it back onto other people's, where that's something they shouldn't be doing. But again, we don't want to get distracted by that at this point. We just want to focus on the state of nature. So again, there's no state of nature at these points. There's no sovereign. So what we'll need to do is go back a little bit further in the next chapter to prior to the Neolithic and look at people before that time, all the way back to what would be called primitive times, to see if we can find a state of nature in there, because that's going to be the strongest point of reference for these people like Locke and Hobbes, because they were comparing, well, they were looking at the people in the New World and saying that they were in a state of nature and assuming that we were once in that state. Like Locke specifically says that all the world was like America before, meaning that all of the world was like the Native Americans living in what he thought was the state of nature. So what we're going to do in the next chapter is going to go even further back and then trying to establish what exactly was going on at these times and whether we can say they had a state of nature or a sovereign. and whether any of that makes any sense to be applied to them. And this will require us to actually go into some depth as to anthropology and modern anthropology as to what's going on with these people, even in the New World, where Hobbes and Locke were looking at them and seeing them as living in the state of nature of equality, and establishing whether they actually were in the New World and in the Old World, and what is actually going on there. Because at the base of this issue is a question of anthropology. And Hobbes and Locke and the early modern people understood that. But modern thinkers don't seem to understand that. They just ignore anthropology, even though that's at the very basis of their point of study. And when you think about this a bit more, it's quite bizarre, because it's like imagining physics, but everybody kind of just disregards the proton or the electron and doesn't really care about them in relation to their point of study. With relation to political theory, modern political theory can't explain anything prior to the 15th or 16th century, really. So they just kind of dump it into separate categories and consider it a separate thing. But if you have a political theory that's applicable now, it should also be applicable in the past, all the way in the past, covering everything. Because if not, then it doesn't really explain anything. Again, it's like having a theory of physics which is only applicable to solids and not liquids or gas or plasma. It's incredibly bizarre. So we do need to go into anthropology, and to do that we have to draw upon resources which wouldn't have been available to others. And one of the main resources which we'll draw upon is going to be the work of Hocart, and also Salins and David Graeber, and especially Salins' work, The Enchanted Universe. Because this will allow us to raise questions about whether these people did live in a state of equality and did live in a state of nature, which will allow us to bring the argument about the state of nature to include the New World, which Locke and Hobbes were including, and not just the Old World. Because it seems like they were making a huge error in regards to thinking that these people are living in a state of nature. And again, that's something we'll come to in the next chapter.